Where are you guys hanging out for a while? Oh, we're live.
Cool. Yeah, now I think we're live. Cool. So thank you all for joining me when I was asked to organize, a panel about DAOs. Then all of you specifically sprung to mind for just the different work that you've been doing, contributing to the space, and overlapping, collaborating together, and just growing a lot. Each of your practice, like individually, as the ecosystem grew and contributing to it. So thank you for joining today. Maybe everyone could introduce themselves briefly and kind of the projects you're working on now and a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. I can jump in and start. Hey everyone, I'm Oren. Beth, thanks for including me on the panel. Really happy to be here. I work with Beth actually at Gnosis, primarily focused on DAO tools, kind of enabling the Gnosis safe as a primitive to extend the functionality of DAOs, and then also a handful of other kind of toolings around DAOs and kind of just increasing their functionality, or I think, I don't know, trying to make them play a little bit nicer together is maybe the current focus. Yeah, Pat, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I'm Pat. I'm the co-founder of Curve Labs. I would describe us as an inter-DAO agency. So we provide governance design services, and we also do quite a bit of development as well. We kind of operate with this thesis that, if DAOs become the dominant, digital organization form, as we hope they will, they are going to need providers like ourselves who are taking the time to help structure them organizationally and, create useful and extensible modules for their use.
Jeff?
Yeah, I can jump in there. Jeff here from the Common Stack. I've been doing a lot of collaborations in the DAO space, with Prime DAO, working on some DAO to DAO primitives and mechanisms. One Hive DAO, we've been working on a lot of different tools. Conviction voting is one, kind of continuous voting over resource allocation. A lot of interesting topics circling around the DAO space in computer-aided governance and a lot of other really neat tools. I think really so much potential in not just individual DAOs, but how we can make DAOs of DAOs, and those interoperability considerations are really interesting moving forward. Happy to be here and happy to discuss with so many pioneers in the space.
Cool.
Hey guys. Thanks Beth for inviting me. I'm Louis. I've been around for a little more than 2 years now. I started working this space through Aragon, DAO framework, and now focusing more. I mean, I've been since the beginning very interested into how online communities and people gathering online on forums, on Discords and stuff. I mean, more recently on Discords. Can leverage DAO tools and start from there, start from community management and state of things, and gradually implement these tools to, depending on different use cases, to enable these communities to do more things and to handle value and create things together. So definitely related to a lot of what you guys do, and I mean I've been knowing you for some time already now. I'm stoked to be here. Now working with Cyber, helping Cyber structure its community and implement what I think are cool Web3 tooling and practices. That's it for me.
Cool. And I'm Beth. So I work at Gnosis with Oren, doing strategic growth marketing right now for DAOs. The DAO tooling is related to Safe, and also Safe in general, which provides infrastructure for a lot of DAOs doing exciting stuff in our ecosystem, and also have been involved in research and strategy about DAOs for the past several years, which is how I came to know all of these awesome guys. So I guess to jump into just some questions, I actually was reading something interesting that Louis was posting earlier today about the role, like the changing role of community management as it relates to, you know, DAOs as an emerging, you know, structure for like collective organization and, you know, managing assets together. And yeah, just since that was at the top of my mind, I was wondering if you would like to talk a little bit about that and the quote that he had highlighted, yeah, literally just before this on Twitter that I thought was really good, about community managers taking care of community operations like a COO would. So managing, you know, the treasuries, voting systems, like these operational goals, and how that fits into, you know, these greater questions about like what it means to manage communities when, you know, tokens are involved, when there's like new ways of holding assets in common that's enabled by DAOs. So yeah, just kind of what is the relationship between DAOs as it relates to the different kind of communities emerging, and how you see these roles changing at this time.
Yeah, I just jump in, but like I love to have others takes as well. I mean, I think taking a step back, like what's very interesting from the space that we knew like a year ago or 2 years ago now is the, you know, breadth of the movement and how it has spread to different cultures and use cases and how people leverage that in different ways. I can see that, you know, today I work more with people who are not like Web3 natives. I mean, for example, like people doing things with NFTs and artists and stuff like are coming through concepts of DAOs and pulling resources and pulling, you know, things and creating together and stuff through NFTs and through their, you know, activities as creatives. And so, yeah, what I think, yeah, when it's like there's many different ways of like yeah, many different ways of to bring like DAOs to the world. I just keep hearing over and over about One Hive. So maybe that's something that Jeff can update us about as such a great example of community that's started just like decentralized in terms of like the culture and that, you know, I mean, obviously Luke has started the community and has been like the kind of source person for it. And is, I think, the lead community manager there. I mean, when I was at Aragon at the time, he was spending some time already just like, you know, initiating and the momentum there and getting people together on calls and kind of like feeding the inspiration and the ideas and stuff, and eventually turned into like this very interesting ecosystem, you know, with very like complex governance and incentive mechanisms that are super interesting. But so yeah, I think it all starts eventually with this kind of like community leader like Luke for One Hive, or artists in their own communities on these discords that collect and create together. And there's this common trait where it's all about like this kind of person inspiring some other people and getting together online, and then the tools go on top of that depending on the use case. But for sure, like I definitely feel that in these organizations, as in, you know, as Vitalik is for Ethereum, like he's a big community manager in a way. Like, you know, a lot of his early work was inspiring people, writing papers, and then getting people together in conferences so that they could interact with each other and create this community over time. So yeah, I think it's a lot about that now. The new CEO is not really a top-down thing; it's more like getting people together and let them do stuff.
And yeah, kind of building off of, you know, this idea of changing, you know, how we would conceive of like leadership roles. I think this also could be an interesting segue into how the work that some of you guys are doing also reconceives like the like strategic partnerships and like, you know, ways of cooperating together between DAOs. So this, you know, could be very cool for Pat and Jeff to maybe talk a bit about like the DAO to DAO negotiation platform that you guys have been working on, and how that can kind of complement more decentralized ways of beginning to collaborate together trustlessly. So,
yeah, Jeff, you want to bite there, or should I?
You start off. Go ahead.
I'll jump into it. So if we analyze the global organizational structure, the global institutional structure, it becomes clear that we can construct a network of ownership relations, and we can know exactly which nodes, which organizations are kind of the most powerful and most controlling nodes within this network. And it so happens to turn out that these are primarily financial transnational corporations, and that should not surprise anyone, I think. And if we look at the particulars of the relationships that they have with each other, there's interesting cycles and cyclical relationships in this network where, you could be dealing with Barclays or JP Morgan, but it turns out they own each other in either indirect or direct fashion. And this is the case for this nucleus of organizations that exist in the global financial core. So, if we proceed from how this exists today and we look at decentralized organizations, I think it becomes logical to say that we need something that's analogous. We need a network of cyclical ownership relations between DAOs, whether we're using governance tokens or some other particular measurement artifact, such as reputation or what have you. And if we can accomplish this through DAO-to-DAO tooling, we will be able to be defensible and resilient against instrumentalization of this very powerful, large connected component of ownership relations. And so, this sort of theoretical background, it's not theoretical, actually. This is exactly how the world is structured. But if we move from this to what is the type of practical tooling we need to accomplish this, we immediately proceed to DAO-to-DAO. We proceed to this idea of we need a generalized negotiation protocol in which these organizations can talk to each other and form these types of complex network structures. And that can mean, assigning ownership to each other in sort of interesting trustless and conditional ways. And this is where, moving forward, we think that something like the Gnosis conditional tokens framework actually lends itself very, very well to these types of complex negotiations, because you can have these embedded conditions and conditions and conditions that allow for sort of this epistemological freedom when you are coming to the specific points of a given negotiation.
Definitely. And yeah, I also love to hear Oren's perspective maybe on, as previously we were working together on this conditional tokens protocol that is the framework for DAO-to-DAO, now focusing on, a more robust suite of DAO tools, that fits in, so.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Pat's saying, like this medium for DAOs to kind of communicate and come to agreement and execute agreements, I think is really, really key for essentially for DAOs to be able to maintain the trust assumptions that I think they strive for, and still and enable this ability for communications. I think one of the other pieces to this that's maybe less obvious, but I've been trying to put some focus into recently, is essentially like the separation of, or the decoupling of like your account standard and your control mechanism. And so, like if we look at the existing DAO frameworks, they all kind of couple those two things together, which makes it really difficult to change things later on. Or it makes essentially what I mean there is, like if you look at an Aragon DAO, a DAO Stack DAO, a Colony, a Moloch DAO, all of them couple the control structure and the account standard. So if they are holding tokens or they're controlling systems, then essentially those systems or tokens are controlled by the same account that is the actual control structure. And so that kind of silos you into only ever using whatever that control structure can do, only ever upgrading along its kind of predefined path. And I think that limits the DAO's ability to evolve and grow. And in the case that Pat's talking about, where you may have over time mergers and acquisitions between organizations, then that coupling of the DAO structure really limits the coupling of the account and the control mechanism really limits the DAO's ability to kind of participate in that network and to kind of grow and change within that network. So yeah, the kind of pattern that I've been trying to push and trying to, I guess, recommend to new DAOs starting up is rather than coupling those two things, essentially create an entity that is like your DAO's account on chain. And so, I mean, obviously from my biased perspective, I'm recommending people use a Gnosis safe for that, but really any kind of contract wallet type thing that's sufficiently flexible is fine. And then have your other decision-making mechanism be a separate contract that then has permission over that, has control over it. And that gives you worlds more flexibility down the line to change and adapt to an ever-shifting landscape.
Yeah, just to add in on that, I think composability and modularity is so important in all of these tools, and we're still in the early days of exploring some of the infrastructure that's being built here, and I completely agreed. Having the ability to layer on functionality. One thing that I think the Common Stack has really been focusing on is contextual governance. There's a lot of the discussion is like in the wider crypto space is like proof of work versus proof of stake. These are protocol consensus mechanisms, but there are so many other ways that we make decisions in DAOs. There are community aspects, the cultural aspects, there are resource allocation aspects, there are consensus protocol aspects. So, having these sort of different governance tools for appropriate context, per DAO, and again, that can change widely from DAO to DAO. So having these kind of layerable, composable tools is really important. And that's one of the reasons we've been focusing so much on token engineering, is that we're rigorously specifying these tools and making sure that they are interoperable and that we know their effects when they are combined, because simple mechanism plus simple mechanism can sometimes lead to completely non-intuitive outcomes in complex systems.
I want to add on to that and make a little plug. I think, when it comes to these proofs, we should hopefully in the future see what I call proofs of presence or reality proofs. We should be looking at impact, verifiable impact in the real world, validating this impact and using that to award decision-making authority to individuals or groups within a particular geography. I think if we can start to do this more effectively, we'll be able to bridge what I see as a divide between all of this sort of digital financialized tooling and people in the real world who are not yet benefiting from it.
So how would you envision something like that being as composable and flexible as I think these approaches that we're seeing now that are making DAOs, really take off in unexpected ways. How can you cover the potential for these use cases without being too prescriptive? For example, lessons that the space has learned about reputation as trying to include that as a top-down mechanism, for example, right?
Yeah, that's a very difficult thing to do. You can first look at sort of historical instances of governance, how governance works across the world. There is sort of this breakdown of type 1 governance where we are sort of putting these specific geographies in place, whether they're nation states or issued municipalities that are created by some sort of government entity that are not really consistent with the actual topology of a given region. And if you ask me, topology is where reality emerges from. It is the structure of the resources of the commons, which ultimately give or should structure the particular flavor of governance for some region. And this is when we get into what is commonly called type 2, which is common space governance, polycentric governance, adaptive governance, the sort of this variety of forms which mediates this sort of tension between the public and the private. So I think by borrowing from these particular disciplines and the history of governance and trying to apply that in a more meaningful way to digital governance, to decentralized governance, we'll come up with something which is more historically consistent and can work with populations on the ground.
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of people conflate governance structures with different types of voting. So I would love to hear, both from like Jeff working on conviction voting and Aaron kind of, working on the ground a lot with different DAOs, implementing Safe Snap, snapshot enabled voting. And, if you would view those as kind of two different approaches for exploring these governance infrastructures, or if, a view that is voting centric is actually really limiting in terms of where, how we could be envisioning voting and how it can guide these communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I will automatically just jump into the latter. Like I think vote centric decision making is archaic. It's 200-year-old technology or older. I think so. Safe Snap uses an example there where we essentially bring snapshot outcomes into on chain via an oracle. I think that's essentially just scratching an itch that already exists. The de facto way that a lot of the DeFi projects in the space have set up their DAO structures was just to create a multisig and then a snapshot space, and the multisig says we'll do what the snapshot says, but there's just this kind of informal control. And so Safe Snap was just an attempt to allow organizations to give their community more formal control using the
Oh no, I think
to move more towards mechanisms that do away with that kind of essentially voting. I think that the real goal, in my opinion, is to engineer systems where the desired behavior or the desired kind of outcome is an emergent result of people acting in their own kind of mutual self-interest. So I think a really great example of that is quadratic funding, where the desired outcome is well allocated funds to public goods projects, and the inputs are people's kind of uncoordinated inputs in their kind of own self-interest. They contribute to projects that they value, and in doing so, those projects earn both their contribution and a portion of the matching pool. From a pool contributor's point of view, the outcome that they are seeking is essentially to efficiently allocate their funds, and by efficiently that I mean, like in the case of quadratic funding, they are able to reduce their bandwidth and elicit more contributions to public goods by putting into a matching pool. So that kind of a system, I think, is a really interesting example of where you have this desired outcome, but you don't need to fall back to voting, explicitly voting yes or no on allocating funds to projects X, Y, and Z. And yeah, I think that type of outcome is where I'd like to see the space head.
I think this design pattern came to be this proposal. Step 1, submit a proposal. Step 2, receive a release of funds. This design pattern sort of is the first logical design pattern that you would have, in the development of any technological system that is trying to do this thing. But it is a very weak governance design pattern. We shouldn't marry ourselves to this thing. That being said, I don't know if we should throw voting, out completely. I think, that might be a baby with the bathwater type of scenario. But I do think that we need to understand, for instance, community rhythms. We need to understand, what is an appropriate cadence for certain types of votes to occur? Because if we are constantly participating in some governance process, then we become exhausted. We become incapable of governing. And if it would be like having a presidential election every month. It's simply too difficult to really manage our time in an effective way. And, you know, maybe we don't have a vote on every proposal that's funded. Maybe we have some sort of funding round or, you know, other social choice mechanism that you know, can efficiently distribute capital or something else like that. But we have to perhaps vote to have the funding round, and we have to decide, okay, how much is being distributed in funding. So if we can take small actions with voting, specific actions that then lead to very big results, I think that's the sweet spot.
Well, so I would say that, you know, a lot of examples that are really exciting emerging from that space are collective ownership, like collective bidding, like in general, coalescing around coordinating with NFTs. So I would love to hear Louis' perspective on that.
Yeah, no, I think I have pretty much the same perspective as Pat and Aaron and Jeff on voting, and I mean on, you know, the fact that it's an old thing, and also I guess we are all kind of Western born people, and that's how we've been raised, kind of like, you know, you vote for things and you vote for people and your delegates in your class when you're young, or you vote for your president or local politician. So that's something that we're very used to, and people are just like say, yeah, let's vote on pretty much anything. And so I mean, definitely think that different types of votes, and also I mean mechanisms like quadratic voting, conventional voting, or quadratic voting can be, you know, useful for different types of use cases and stuff, to just like and match them with certain actions as the right, you know, right incentive mechanisms or right ways to interpret the voice of people in the organization. I also think that I think, as Pat said, there's just like, it's, I mean, one person, one vote, especially. I think voting is one thing. One person, one vote is kind of like the thing that people refer to, like the kind of like the democratic ideal. There's a lot of inefficiencies, and I'm pretty bullish on different projects that just focus on creating subsets of, you know, subcommittees that get granted permissions and you know, rights and obligations, and get allocated a portion of funds, as Pat said. And just like, because, yeah, I mean, attention is scarce, and people just have to, you know, focus on what they're good at, or what they're, you know, they're relevant, they have like relevant knowledge for. So yeah, I definitely see like a couple of projects now that I'm sure will be, you know, ready within the next 18 months, that are focusing on just, yeah, creating these substructures, subcommittees, subtreasuries that, you know, will just let us create way more granular kind of community structures, and that will kind of, I think, improve things a little bit. And yeah, when it comes to, you know, like this kind of like fund management, collecting as a group or creating as a group, collector DAOs, creator DAOs that have been popping up everywhere, you know, most often it's just like, thanks Gnosis, it's a multisig, Gnosis multisig, you know, that people use, and then there's one person executing the transaction and then sending back the NFT to the vault or something like that. I mean, there's no obvious flow, and obviously, like, I think things like Gnosis Safe, Snap Safe, or SafeNap, I don't know how you say it, but will help, you know, kind of like improve the UX for these flows. But there's no ideal. I'm looking forward to actually having, you know, multisigs integrated here and there as well, because I think that could be an interesting experience as well for people to, you know, collect as a group or share funds as a group. I mean, yeah, if you guys are interested in such things, yeah, I think that's super. Yeah, that's kind of how I see it now. But we have a long way to go to fluidify these things.
Yeah, definitely. Well, in terms of like the multisigs being used in that context, like that, I think that pattern is becoming more and more common, especially now that the Gnosis Safe UI it's become so much easier to integrate an application into the UI, and then also so many applications have Wallet Connect as an authentication standard. It's been like that use case of kind of spinning up a Gnosis safe to share assets between a group of people, and you then use that to interact with all kinds of different dApps is definitely becoming more and more common. I wanted to jump back to Pat's point a minute ago about voting and just make a quick kind of distinction there. I think so the type of decision making that I was talking about, where you want to have some desired outcome as this kind of emergent result. I think mechanisms that do that are generally really good at solving specific problems, and voting is generally better at solving for much less kind of well-defined problem sets. So it's like when you need decision making for just like a generalized use case, you probably end up having to fall back to some form of voting, or at least have the end result be some form of voting, even if you have some other mechanism, that can try to make the decision firsthand, and then if everything goes awry, then eventually you fall back to some form of voting. But yeah, I think ideal case, you want to have your organization. I think, Jeff, this is kind of what you were getting at, is have your organization be able to identify where it has specific sets of problems that it wants to solve, and eventually kind of implement a mechanism that is really well suited to making decisions for that set of problems, as opposed to just relying on voting to make every decision. And there's obviously a bunch of complexity in that once you start kind of layering and intermingling different decision-making mechanisms. But I feel like that's that goal of being able to identify problem sets and the best mechanism for making decisions around that problem set is really important for allowing organizations to operate efficiently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we're working on kind of fleshing out these polycentric governance tools, and starting with, coming from the DAO space and coming from the community space are very different, because the DAO space has the tools and the understanding of the tool, and oftentimes it's tool first. It's how can we solve problems with this tool, whereas communities on the ground don't know what tools are out there. They just have the problems that are in their hands. And I think there's a bit of a disconnect still between communities on the ground and DAO tooling, because they don't quite see how those tools solve the problems that they have. So really breaking it down into, okay, what types of tools are fit to a certain context of decision making. So in the TEC and the Token Engineering Commons, we're really fleshing this out a bit more. We have a certain type of governance for resource allocation. So this is going to be conviction voting. There are lots of properties of this voting tool that are conducive to that. It's continuous. It doesn't require majoritarian support, because of course, once we move into decentralized settings, it's much more difficult to get quorum on decision making. You can't get everyone in the room and say, hey, we're going to talk about these problems for 3 hours in a town hall, and then we're going to make a decision on them. But people are all over the world. They're in different time zones. So it's, that type of coordination is quite difficult in decentralized communities. Now, the governance you use for resource allocation may not be the same governance you have, for example, like emergency risk management. You probably want a much shorter pipeline. You need more knowledgeable stakeholders. So it really breaks down into, what type of roles are associated with what types of decisions, what access do they have, and what tool is appropriate to that context. And one thing Louis just mentioned, actually, I think we have this idea of one person, one vote as a democratic ideal, but this also leads to, a tyranny of the majority. And if you look up the false promise of one person, one vote, I think it has worked for sort of our pencil and paper democracies, because this is how we vote today. We take a rock and we scratch on a piece of tree, and then we hand that in and we tally those up. And this is like it can't be any more complex, because how are we going to do that? We're going to confuse people. But once we turn this into digital access tokens, and I think everyone should have a voice, of course, but some people should have more voice depending on the decision. In a plane, we don't fly planes by one person, one vote. One person gets all the say, and everyone else just sits back and trusts the expert. And of course, that's not a democratic system. But I think there's a huge governance space here, and I think we're only beginning to explore in different areas, different tools that can be useful for different ways of kind of this social signal aggregation. That's really what we're doing, is aggregating social consensus, and it's a lot of signal processing, in terms of how we collect that information, how we weight that information. Quadratic voting is just an optimization of that. So really looking at these as signals from kind of social sensors are the people in these DAOs. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at it.
Yes.
Go ahead, Lee.
Yeah, I just have a follow-up question for you guys in general, for Jeff and for everyone. What do you think about, so Gitcoin just launched their token, and I think there's delegation going with it. So I don't think that's something that we've seen a lot at scale like that. What do you guys think about the delegation and this kind of like protocol politician kind of thing, with this small celebrities that get the clout also to influence, DAO governance and stuff?
I mean, I think it's practical. It's very practical because, like Pat talked about before, there's a certain amount of bandwidth that's required to really follow a governance process, especially if it's going to be having some kind of regular cadence of proposals. And then on top of that, like just keeping up with the proposals, there's a certain level of knowledge that's more than likely required about the decisions. I think if you're making for instance, decisions about variables to change in a protocol, it may not be immediately obvious to the vast majority of voters what the impact of those decisions are going to be. Tweaking a variable may seem like a simple choice, but could have very real implications on how the system functions. And so, the ability to delegate both is practical in terms of allocating your bandwidth efficiently, and then also practical in terms of understanding where you actually have the ability to make an informed decision. And being able to delegate that decision-making power, your kind of modular impact on this system, on this decision, to someone that you trust to make that decision in your place. I'd say, for anyone that's thinking about using delegation, the real key to it is making sure that you can always pull back your voting power and use it whenever you want. So if I'm going to delegate to Jeff, because I trust his decision on the vast majority of things, but then a proposal comes up where I really think I understand it and I want to take the time to actually commit my vote, that I should be able to use my vote, and rather than Jeff having kind of unilateral access. And I think that's where delegation kind of in an on-chain system is vastly superior to the kind of delegation that we see in like a representative democracy currently, where you get the chance to make that delegation once every 3 or 4 years, and you have to live with whatever your representatives do with your vote delegation, for the rest of that period. But being able to kind of move it in and out, or kind of control it relatively fluidly, is really, really practical and useful, in my opinion.
I think delegation, yes, is practical and useful. Focusing on Gitcoin specifically, I think their execution was very poor, to be honest. I think, if you are going to have some sort of delegated election, there needs to be a dialogue and an understanding of the candidates' positions. And, let's take the number one issue that Gitcoin is wrestling with right now. They're sitting on, 400 million Shiba tokens. I think it's 400 million. I don't have the precise number. And this is really upsetting the Shiba community. And, it's kind of a big problem that needs to be worked out. Now, when I was selecting a delegate to delegate my Gitcoin governance tokens, because I did receive some, I had no idea what their positions were on this critical issue that Gitcoin is now facing. There was no sort of video logs, them stating, why am I a good delegate? As a candidate, what do I bring to the table? If we are going to play this political game, we need to play it fully. We need to fully commit to this transparent communicative process. And it was very clear from what Gitcoin did, the people who were most involved with Gitcoin were the people you could select as delegates There was no information describing, what these people believe or support. And from the start, this was not a real election. This was a sense of role play. And I don't think that is the right way to execute something so important.
I think that's also where the framing that Jeff was mentioning comes into play in an interesting way of conceptualizing people playing these different roles as acting as social censors versus necessarily, being an accurate representative. Yeah, I would just love to hear your perspective of if there is a possible reframing of that critique.
I'll fight back on behalf of Gitcoin real quick. There was actually a process, although it maybe wasn't so obvious on the landing page that they built. There was a process to submit yourself as a delegate and kind of articulate your platform, why you think you would be a good person to delegate to. It's up on their forum. If you go and check out the Introducing Stewards Governance thread on the gov.gitcoin.co, you can see everyone that was listed as a delegate on the landing page. They're kind of the platform that they created. Now, granted, most of them just say, "Hey, I'm Oren, and I would like Ethereum, and public goods are pretty cool." But it is there. But I agree. It probably could have been executed better. I think there's always room for improvement.
And they definitely made a good effort. Yeah.
And I think a vote of solidarity. Creating democracy is really hard, and creating inclusive democracy. You're kind of building the car while you're handing out driver's licenses, while you're figuring out what goes in the driver's education course. You're doing a lot of things at once. And I think it's the layer of, or the concentric circles of inclusivity will expand as groups get better at this. But speaking from our own experience, there's sometimes just so much to communicate. Trying to get everybody on the same page when people are coming from vastly different backgrounds almost requires its own Rosetta Stone, because you say something to one group and another group interprets it entirely differently. I'm really excited about delegated voting. I think it creates sort of this interesting bottom-up politics dynamic rather than top-down. In top-down, we have these representatives kind of dangled to us. Yes, and anyone can apply to be those positions, but to get high enough, there are some pretty massive barriers. To be running for president, you need bankrolls of millions of dollars. You're probably old, rich, and white, which isn't really representative or democratic at those levels. But when we flip it upside down and we create delegated voting systems where you can pass your vote on, it not only creates this sort of bottom-up dynamic, it also respects the weight that each person represents. Because in a traditional election, even if say the mayor of Calgary was really popular, he had probably the majority of the city's vote, but he still only gets one voice on the council of everyone else, and some of those councillors may not have near the support he does. But still, it kind of goes to, you have one person, one voice, or one person, one vote, even at the council level. So we have kind of these sort of weird misshapings of voice along the way. And I think delegated voting is an interesting way to kind of maintain that fidelity that, your vote didn't count for nothing if your candidate didn't get in. It's still there, even if it's weighted accordingly, to your whatever expertise or skin in the game or how impacted you are by a decision. I think there's a lot of interesting ways we can include more stakeholders with tokens. And speaking outside of the sort of plutocratic DAO, buy your vote token thing today, we can allocate tokens to people who are most impacted by a decision, to people who have the most expertise around a decision. And of course, this can, change how we make sure that's inclusive is another question. But we now have this new tool with tokens to make sure that the right stakeholders are in on these decisions and that their voice is weighted appropriately.
Yeah, to add on to that and to maybe revive a thread that we already mentioned, with the DAO to DAO, it's not only a single token we can use now. We can use these token composites. We can use LP tokens, for instance, You look at something like a balancer pool, which can have up to 8 different tokens in it. And we can use the balancer pool token that is generated from the combination of these 8 tokens as a governance token. So now we have the opportunity to build DAO-to-DAO relationships that the skin in the game is actually a literal collaborative skin in the game through this combined liquidity that they're pooling.
Yeah, super cool. So what kind of new directions for DAOs or expanded possibilities for accessible participation in DAOs do you think that some of these kind of new infrastructures that are being created or new approaches that are being pioneered will open up in the near future or are already?
Yeah, on my end, sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
No, go ahead.
That's cool.
I was just going to give a plug for computer-aided governance. So, I mean, of course, taking that statement carefully, it's not computer-controlled governance, it's computer-aided governance. So ultimately, in governance, we want inclusive and informed. And that's really hard to get. If you have a small group of people, you can get them highly informed, but it's not very inclusive. The wider you make that circle, the more inclusive you are, but the less informed likely everyone is going to be. And with tools like DAOs and having these blockchains with sort of this rich temporal data streams, we can get people better information as to how the decisions they're making will impact the system that they're operating in. And if we can and of course that's a whole UX can of worms, because you have to get the right information, and information can be twisted, of course, in many different ways, as we know, looking at Brexit, right? They had information they were peddling to a bunch of people about how the NHS was losing money to the EU, which turned out not to be true at all. So, how we get that information, of course, we have to be very careful, but I think there's some really interesting opportunities with on-chain data that is verifiable, at least to some degree, and how we can get that information to voters or delegates of voters who can then act on that information, both inclusive and informed, or at least heading in that direction.
Yeah, and you guys are doing a really great job on that, I would say, with the educational aspects and bringing in more people to a community that is trained in understanding these things. So it's really nice.
There's some really interesting dashboards coming out of the Token Engineering Commons launch. Even like before the DAO starts today, you can participate in a DAO, but when you're launching a DAO, unless you're doing your own, you generally don't have a say as a community member. Someone chooses the parameters, whether that's the quorum or support required or whatnot. And the TEC is really taking that to sort of the proto-DAO stage. Before you even launch the DAO, how do you want your DAO set up? What kind of parameters do you want to decide on? And here's the dashboard, and you can play with the parameters and run a simulation and see what kind of DAO that creates before you even create it. So there's some really interesting stuff going on in the Token Engineering Commons space as well, for sure.
Definitely want to check that out.
If we're speculating...
No, go ahead, Pat. Go ahead.
This is the most polite panel. So if we are speculating, sort of on the future of where this is all going, or where perhaps as creators, we sort of want to performatively drive this thing. I know, from my interest, I would like to bring DAOs to the real world. I think we've reached a sort of a credible level of maturity where we can start to experiment, with actors and in the real existing world who want to apply this technology to the networks that they're a part of. We look at phenomena such as the solidarity economy or the social and solidarity economy, as it's called. There are these collaborative networks that exist and could benefit from having some sort of interior liquidity to manage that exists parallel to the states and state-issued liquidity. And I believe that DAOs, the tooling is getting to the point where, this can happen, and they can start to manage their communities and their local economies in this way, with community currencies, complementary currencies, and the like. And we're seeing just a lot of evidence that this is possible and feasible. You look at Will Ruddick in Kenya, the experiments that have been done with the Sarufu credit there, and just all of the experiments that have happened in the digital space as well. The emergent growth or the super growth of the assets under management by DAOs. And I think it's time, let's bridge this gap.
Yeah, sorry. I think Arn wanted to add something.
No, I was saying Louis had tried to.
Yeah, no, just like a very quick note. I mean, I'm always very obsessed about how people will collaborate inside of DAOs. I mean, in many ways, we're kind of figuring out, how to deal with treasuries. I mean, crypto is about putting value online, and it starts with like treasuries and capital and solving liquidity problems and all these things before community can really have value flowing inside of themselves. And I mean, Gnosis is a lot about that, and all the liquidity provider technologies are a lot about that as well. And then comes governance, because you need to make decisions, allocate these resources and stuff, and that's also a very hot topic. I'm also interested with what will come after that, in terms of like how people will kind of like, how do you track contributions, how do you structure these different departments or groups in a DAO, and how do you do that efficiently in a way that's mapped to to on-chain basically. And so, yeah, I'm pretty excited about all the things that are going to happen. There are exciting projects like ORCAP protocol working on interesting solutions there. The Yearn, community has been doing cool stuff with Coordinate and stuff, trying to, spread power and decision making through like distributing, people making contributions and accruing reputation in a peer-to-peer fashion. So yeah, I'm really like what's going to happen once we figure out, like, I mean, it's definitely like something that we're going to figure out on an ongoing basis at every level and very interdependent. But what's going to happen inside of these DAOs, it's what I'm really excited about.
Yeah.
So there's two things that I'm really looking forward to the DAO space doing. One, I think kind of stems from the decoupling of accounts and control structures, and that is then the ability to create essentially these like interdimensional DAOs, organizations that live on one chain, one execution environment, but are able to have a presence on others. So maybe you have a Moloch DAO on XDAI that's able to control a Gnosis safe over on mainnet, and one on Optimism, and one on Polygon. So I think that's going to be a really interesting thing. It's one of the things that we're working on at Gnosis right now. And then the other thing that I'm really excited about, and I think that the DAO space desperately needs, is essentially collusion resistance. So right now, every DAO framework puts voting out in the open. You can either see how people have voted kind of in real time, or eventually, through some commit reveal scheme, all of the votes are revealed. And so this makes it really easy to collude and bribe and essentially kind of poison the decision-making mechanisms. And so frameworks like Macy, the minimal anti-collusion infrastructure that enable for secret voting through zero-knowledge proofs, I think those type of things, as they start to become more widely understood and implemented into various decision-making mechanisms, are going to be an absolute boon for the DAO ecosystem. And Pat, do you want to jump in and handle the audience question?
I'll leave that to someone else, but I wanted to piggyback on what you just said. So we were doing some user research in Curacao because we are interested in perhaps having some DAO experiment there. And one thing we discovered is if the votes are not private, there is always the possibility of the person who loses simply driving over to your house and threatening you. And that was never something we thought about in the research. So there is a need for this privacy.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I can jump on and handle this question. And how can you stop a malicious DAO member voting against the best interest of the project? And I think that really depends on the decision-making mechanism that you're using. And I guess also how you're defining the best interest of the project. If it's I've heard a lot of people say in the past, if a system can't be 51% attacked, then it's not decentralized. And so it's like, if you have I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but it's definitely something I've heard parroted a lot. And if that's the case, if an actor can get 51% of the vote, then maybe they are acting in the best interest of the project. I would say probably not, because there's some situations where you probably want minority protections in the system, probably all the time. But yeah, it's a difficult thing to protect against, absolutely, but should definitely factor into your mechanism design. I think it's good to have counterbalances to any decision-making mechanism, fallbacks to protect against potentially malicious proposals, but that obviously almost always means delegating some power to some other decision-making mechanism, and so potentially just kicks the can down the road to somewhere that can be somewhere else that can kind of be exploited. I mean, governance capture is a really hard problem. And I don't know, I don't have a definitive answer on how you can protect against it, other than just being very deliberate in your design and understanding the risks and limitations.
And I know you have also done, some elegant, like constructing futuraki experiments or frameworks. Like, do you think that an explicit focus on futuraki is one way to combat this, or maybe more in theory than practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think futuraki is really interesting because it's, again, like in theory, it hasn't really been used in practice, but in theory, it should really align incentives towards kind of achieving some specific metric. That the really difficult part of that is defining the metric in such a way that it's actually what the organization wants. It's the best interest of the organization. Like anytime you create a metric, then the incentive shifts from the best interest of the organization, this kind of fuzzy word, to maximizing for this metric. And so those two things aren't necessarily the same, or are quite often not the same. And so like a proposal that may maximize for the metric is not necessarily in the best interest of the organization. And so again, going back to my point earlier, like the thing that you really need to be conscious of is like the design of the mechanism and the risks and kind of trade-offs you make when you go and implement that mechanism.
That makes a lot of sense. Cool. Well, I have one more question for you guys before we close up, which is, we're speaking at a developer conference. Like what, out of all of the different elements that we've covered, and there's so much space for growth and different exciting possibilities for building in the space, like what would, you guys recommend as something exciting for developers to delve into? And is anybody here hiring for developers to build on some of these tools?
I bet everyone's hiring. That's the space right now, right?
You should inverse that question. What is not interesting and who's not hiring?
Yeah. So yeah, if anybody is hiring to work on some of these interesting things, if you would like to speak a little bit about that to maybe inspire some people, developing here. So.
Yeah, I mean, from Gnosis' side, we're hiring. We have a whole bunch of dev and other positions open. You can find them on gnosis.io/careers. That's for things like the Gnosis Safe, for the DAO tools built on top of the Gnosis Safe, and then also for a handful of other projects that Gnosis works on, things like Gnosis Auction, Gnosis Protocol, Open Ethereum. So yeah, anywhere that you want to jump into the Ethereum ecosystem, I think Gnosis has probably a touch point for it if you're interested in. If anyone wants to come and dive in or ask questions about the Gnosis Safe or any of the DAO tools that we're working on, come join us in our Discord at chat.gnosis.io.
Yeah, the professional response here is Curve Labs has a number of open listings for various developers. We would love to have a talk, if working on DAOs interest you. Like I said, we work across the space with many different DAOs, and there's kind of a very, very high demand for our services and this expertise, because I personally consider it a growing discipline and speciality that'll continue to be important in the future.
One call out I like to give is that this space needs so much more than developers as well. There's a huge need for it, but there's also a massive need for social scientists and anthropologists and researchers of all kinds, because ultimately these tools have to connect with the real world somewhere. And I think that interface is going to be much more difficult to navigate than the tech alone. It's making the tech useful for these situations on the ground, and there's so much kind of bridge building that needs to happen between the real world as we know it today and the world that DAOs and a lot of crypto denizens live in. There's a massive chasm of understanding and UX and everything else, and I think we're building the bridge from this side, and other groups are building the bridge from this side, and somewhere we have to meet in the middle. But I think there's so much opportunity even outside of traditional employment as well, which is really neat about this space, is you can just work for DAOs as a freelancer. You don't have to take a traditional role within a traditional company, although plenty are hiring. There's also the opportunity to kind of dip your toes in and play with the DAOs and the interfaces that really make sense to you. And I think that's one of the big things that got me into the space was that this space needs all kinds of people. It's not just developer focus. It's we need so much help in translating these concepts and really getting them out there to a wider audience.
Perfectly said.
Yeah, I totally agree with Jeff. I'll just say same for us. There's a space called breezy.hr. Super has a page there with all the job listings and stuff. If you're interested to work with NFTs and creatives and a community that is definitely going to over time adopt more and more DAO tooling. And yeah, I think there are tons of, I think it all really depends on yourself when you want to work somewhere. As a developer, for sure. I think that today, there are tons of needs to just integrate the different DAO tools that exist today and build the bridges also between these tools. So any integration the things that are happening with Gnosis and Snapshot and all this all the time unlock tons of value and use cases. So if you're an independent and creative person, definitely recommend to find for this kind of gap holes and fill them and create value for the space, and it'll quickly bring you to the forefront of it.
Many opportunities to continue collaborating and building new paradigms, and I'm really excited to see what emerges throughout the summer and through the year. So cool. Well, thank you guys so much for chatting with me and giving your unique perspectives about this. I thought it was a really great discussion. So thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.
Great to see you all.
It was great.
Definitely.
Thanks, guys.